Next tonight, an update on the World Trade Center bombing trial. February's bombing was an act of urban terror that shocked the world and set off fears of a wave of terrorism on American soil. But within weeks, the FBI charged 7 members of a Muslim fundamentalist group with the bombing. In June, the FBI made more arrests and said members of the same group had planned a second wave of bombings of other New York City landmarks. 4 of the 7 men charged in the World Trade Center bombing are now on trial. The others are awaiting trial. We begin our coverage with this backgrounder from correspondent Tom Bearden.
The trial is taking place in federal court in Lower Manhattan, just blocks from the Trade Center itself, the scene last February of one of the worst terrorist incidents in American history. Extra security precautions were added after the prosecutors received death threats. FBI agents with earphones are a constant presence during each session. Jurors are identified only by number, and Judge Kevin Duffy even asked the courtroom artist to draw the jurors only from behind. In his opening statement, lead prosecutor J. Gilmore Childers said defendant Ahmed Ajaj had brought bomb-making materials and videotape into the country. He said defendant Mahmoud Abu Halima mixed and provided the chemicals. Defendant Nidal Ayad, he said, provided the chemical engineering expertise to make the bomb. And defendant Mohammed Salameh was accused of being involved in several phases, including renting the warehouse where the chemicals were stored and renting the van to carry the bomb. Initial testimony recalled the horror of the blast itself, with diagrams of the bomb crater and emotional testimony from survivors. From the start, the government acknowledged that it had no witnesses who actually saw the defendants do anything illegal. The result has been long days of tediously technical testimony as the government tries to build up its circumstantial case bit by bit. There are charts, maps, forensic photos of bloody victims. There's a veritable auto junkyard of blast-damaged vehicle parts. There are expert witnesses. Childers says it's all part of a chain that will link the defendants to the explosion that killed 6 people in the Trade Center's garage and injured more than 1,000 others. The key physical evidence was a yellow Ryder rental van like this one. Prosecutors say the van brought the explosives to the garage and that defendant Salameh had rented it from a lot in New Jersey a few days before. The bomb reduced everything in its vicinity to twisted metal, so prosecutors sought to make their case by linking the tiny increments of evidence together into larger patterns. Elaborate charts showed where each fragment of rubble was found to establish the pattern of the blast and place the location of the vehicle responsible. The jurors saw dozens of those crumpled parts. They heard testimony from experts who connected the wreckage back to the Ryder truck firm from identification numbers stamped on each part, then back to Salameh, the last person who rented it. Salameh has never denied he rented the van. His lawyer, Robert Precht, says he reported it stolen and never used it to carry explosives to the Trade Center.
The government is arguing that Mr. Salameh's conduct was consistent with that of a person who had just plotted to blow up the World Trade Center. And what I attempted to do before the jury is to show that at key points in the days before, during, and after the World Trade Center bombing, Mr. Salameh acted as a man who had a completely innocent state of mind. And you have to ask yourself whether it is believable that a man who has been charged with blowing up the World Trade Center would have rented the vehicle in his own name, giving true addresses and true phone numbers, whether he would have reported this very vehicle stolen 15 hours before the World Trade Center explosion.
After the first month, the case took a surprise twist with the news that a key government informant, Ahmed Salem, had taped his talks with FBI agents. Salem had penetrated the circle of Muslim fundamentalists, which included Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. Members of the group have been charged either in the Trade Center case or in a second plot to blow up other New York City landmarks. When transcripts of the tapes were leaked to the press, they showed that Salem had warned the FBI about the general outlines of the bomb plot well before the Trade Center blast. The transcript quotes an FBI agent telling Salem his agency had failed to act in time, saying, "The fact of the matter is that nothing was done about it. If it had been handled correctly, we should have been able to intervene." The jury has not yet heard those tapes. They raise the possibility that defense lawyers may use them to charge government entrapment or move for a mistrial.
For more on the story, we're joined by Peg Tyre, a reporter for New York Newsday, who's been covering the trial since it began. We're now in the 7th week. What can you say has been achieved by all this slow accumulation of evidence?
I think that the government has so far focused on Ajaj, who is Ahmed Ajaj, one of the 4 defendants in this case. And they have incrementally, using up until now, I guess 98 witnesses, have established that Ajaj traveled to this country with another defendant who's now a fugitive. And he was carrying bombing manuals and was intercepted at JFK by INS agents.
And he had 4 passports.
He had 4 passports, and he was sharing aliases with this other defendant, Ramzi Youssef.
And he was a man, although he just worked in a pizza joint, I think in Houston, had a first-class ticket from Pakistan to airline ticket to come here.
There are several mysterious things about Mr. Ajaj. He presented a Swedish passport with a picture, his picture, superimposed on top of the actual picture. He had a very curious story about how he got that passport, what his citizenship was, where he resided, and he seemed to have a lot of artifacts from the Afghanistan conflict, including Mujahideen postcards of, I would assume, friends of his standing on top of a train holding a rifle in victory.
Now, was he the one who is also supposed to have been tortured by Israeli security people?
That's fairly well documented.
That is documented that he was.
There are photographs of him when he was released by the Israeli police, and he was delivered here by the Red Cross, and he did undergo extreme torture. And according to people who knew him when he first arrived here, was quite a mentally unbalanced man as a result of that torture.
And he tried to kill himself last week?
He did.
In jail? To describe that, what do we know about that?
Well, we know that there was some sort of communication between himself and another defendant, Bilal al-Qazi. What happened is they tried to hang themselves and also cut the veins in their arms. It was interrupted by guards, and I guess there was a brief lockdown situation because the other prisoners began a small riot. Which I don't think is uncommon, but in this case it's supposed to be a secure facility, so it was of utmost importance to the Bureau of Prisons.
And you've seen a judge in court since that attempt?
I have. He seems pale, and it's not clearly not an easy time for him. He seems under a lot of stress, and all of the defendants have complained repeatedly to the judge about their treatment. They find it very difficult to live in prison, as many would, and they find that the meals are inadequate because of their dietary restrictions, and they feel that they need to have more contact. Ajaj is thousands of miles from his family and has very few visitors or contact with people outside of his fellow defendants.
How strong is the case against him? You said they've concentrated on him so far.
Well, so far, they've established that he came to this country, that he used a false passport, and that he was carrying bombing manuals. Carrying bombing manuals is not a crime. The bombing manuals were in fact printed here in Illinois, so he was just carrying back an Arabic translation of those manuals. He served 6 months for presenting a false passport. He served his time for that. There is one element that remains to be seen in the government's case against Ajaj, and that is some tapes that they made of his conversations from Otisville, a prison in New York, and from MCC, the prison in New York City. If those conversations can tie him to a larger conspiracy, I think he's in a lot of trouble, but they'd have to be very strong conversations and conversations.
And that would be relevant to the second trial that's coming up, would it?
No, that would be for the first
trial.
For
the first trial,
If he had talked to other people who might have been involved in the explosion at the World Trade Center, if he had had conversations with these defendants, if he had spoken about the act before it happened, anything like that would indicate that he had some involvement beyond what they accuse him of, which is bringing bombing manuals in. The question comes up, if he brought the bombing manuals in and they were intercepted at JFK, then how was that the recipe for the bomb if they were?
So far a questionable case against him.
I think he's the weakest.
He's the weakest. All right, let's just go very quickly through the others. Mr. Abu Halima, who was charged with having run the warehouse and mixed the chemicals that allegedly went into the bomb. What about that case?
Today was the first day they mentioned Mahmoud Abu Halima's name, and they said that he was a visitor to another defendant's apartment. They've never mentioned him in terms of any criminal acts, and I have a feeling they're going to save him for last, as he is probably the most problematic. He played if you can believe the government's opening statements, he played a very key organizational role, and yet he didn't leave many fingerprints. He didn't sign many things. He was probably the smartest of the group. What they do have, as far as I know, is they do have an eyewitness. But it's not a trained eyewitness. It's not a federal investigator, a police officer. It's a fellow at a gas station where they filled up the van, the gas tank of the van. Mm-hmm. And that's the person who was pivotal for the government's case. They also have discussed other forensic evidence, but I am somewhat skeptical about that.
And you haven't heard it all yet presented?
I haven't heard any of it yet.
And Ajaj, the man who is supposed to have provided the chemical engineering expertise.
Nidal Ajaj has had a few witnesses speak to his case, a few government witnesses, and I have to say that one of them was at one time partially quite damning and partially quite charming on his behalf, a secretary who he worked with who said that he was a lovely man and was very concerned about America and the freedoms here and very much enjoyed them and was happy to talk about it
and
at
quite
length.
Impressed when he got his American citizenship.
Very happy about that. And but she also testified that about 45 minutes after the explosion, he came to tell her that terrorists had bombed the World Trade Center. Now we know that even police radio was putting out that it was a transformer fire. So it would suggest that he had some foreknowledge. There's also a problem with Nidal Ajaj's defense in that he had in his computer there was a copy of the letter which was sent to various organizations taking credit for the bombing. That's going to be a difficult piece of evidence to argue around.
And finally, of these four, Mohammed Salameh, whose lawyer we just saw on that, who rented the van, what is the case there? Is that a good case?
I think the government has a very strong case against him. Salameh is the man who signed the leases. He's the man who ordered the chemicals in his name or in his alias, his consistent alias. He left a paper trail. He was easily spotted by others. I think that probably there's so much paper on him, there's so many receipts they have from chemical companies that I think that he's probably the one most likely to be convicted.
Now, what about connections with other countries? I mean, we've talked about Ajaj coming from Pakistan, and somebody paid for a first-class airline ticket for a guy who works in a pizza joint. And two of the 7 people accused have absconded, and there are rumors that they've gone to Iraq. What has come out, and what do we know about who paid for this and connections with international terrorism, other governments, whatever?
That's the question everyone wants to know, and unfortunately the government is not trying that case. They're trying a case on minute forensic evidence. A stain here, a chemical here, a receipt here. We're never getting the big picture because I think that case is impossible to prosecute. A case involving international conspiracy is far beyond the scope of what they want to tackle. So it's been the great question and the great unknown. There is money involved in this, but not a tremendous amount of money. There were plane tickets, $2,000 here. There were chemical receipts. But this bomb was not that expensive. It was $3,000. The van was $200 to rent. This is not a high-priced operation. This is not a plastic explosive, high-paid operatives. These are pizza guys and taxi drivers and not people who are commanding a great salary.
Would you expect that when the wider conspiracy trial begins, in a few weeks' time?
No, that won't be until it's hard to say, but probably the spring.
The spring. Well, would you think that would be where the government would try and make wider connections, or does it not have the evidence to do that?
I don't think they have I haven't heard it, if they have. And my sense is that that is much more of a homegrown operation than the World Trade Center explosion. Mm-hmm. Although many of the people involved in both these cases had ties to the Afghanistan conflict and traveled frequently to Pakistan, and I don't think there'll be much of an international scope to that case at all. We know that the World Trade Center bombers, because of the work that we've done at Newsday, we're on the telephone constantly, calling a vast array of countries, Middle Eastern countries, constantly. I mean, to the tune of maybe 15 calls an hour to Egypt. So we know that they were in constant contact, but that's not the case that's being tried.
Okay. Well, we'll bring you back when we're further along in the trial. Peg TYRE, thank you.
Great. Thanks.